Hi everyone, welcome to the Future of Mobility webinar. I'm Ash and I'm your host for today. Let's have a quick run through of the program for today. Firstly, we will have Dr. Lynette Cheah, our moderator, to introduce the webinar to us. She's an associate professor from SUTD. Following that, we will have a presentation by Mr. Michael Chadney, who's a senior consultant from Arup. Next, we will have a presentation by Dr. Raymond Ong, who is an associate professor from NUS. Last but not the least, we will have a presentation by Dr. Yap, who is an associate professor from NTU. Following the presentations, we will have some time set aside for the moderated discussion and questions and answer. Now, we are honored to have Dr. Lynette moderate this webinar. She's an associate professor of engineering systems at the Singapore University of Technology and Design. She's interested in pathways towards sustainable mobility, particularly in congested urban environments. Her research develops data-driven solutions to reduce the environmental impacts of passenger and urban freight transport. She's also the member of Singapore's Public Transport Council and a review editor for the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC's 6th assessment report. I welcome Dr. Lynette to open the webinar. Dr. Lynette, please.
Thank you so much, Ash. Good afternoon, everyone. Very glad to see all of us here in this Future of Mobility webinar. I think we have more than 200 participants, so this must be a very interesting and exciting topic for all of us. So this event is organized as part of the Urban Redevelopment Authority's ongoing long-term plan review. The long-term plans guide the development of Singapore, mapping out land uses as well as transport and infrastructure needs over the next 50 years and beyond. So the aim is to prepare Singapore for the future by ensuring future generations will have the flexibility to meet future land uses while shaping Singapore into a more sustainable and livable city. So the long-term plans are reviewed every 10 years to ensure it continues to be relevant in the face of evolving trends as well as changing needs and aspirations of our people. The year-long public engagement exercise to hear Singapore's views on our long-term plans has been running since July last year and will continue until the middle of this year. So the public engagement exercise has been organized along 4 themes so far. You may have been participating in some of this. The themes are the future of the environment, future of living, future of work, and aligned with today's topic, the future of mobility. So this theme of future of mobility is actually designated as a theme for this month. So look out for some activities related to that. And in line with the long-term plan review and this theme, we will be discussing key trends that will impact Singapore's journey towards sustainable urban mobility. So I'm very glad that you're all tuning in today to engage in a discussion together. We have a very exciting panel lined up. And the key topics that we're going to cover include the integration of land use and transport planning, sustainable modes of transport and a car-light lifestyle, preparing for future shifts in technologies, innovations, and preferences, which will transform the way we move and how goods are moved around the city. So I invite all of you to offer questions through the Q&A function rather than the chat, and we'll be reviewing that and try to get do our best to get to address all of them after the end of the panel presentations. So let's begin our conversation. I'm very pleased to welcome our first speaker, Mr. Michael Chadney from Arup, Singapore. So Michael is a transport strategy and future mobility specialist. He previously spent 7 years based in Tokyo, Japan, working on sustainable transport projects across Asia. So his work in Singapore includes master planning, active mobility, and research into the integration of future mobility into the built environment, which includes a recent collaboration with URA on autonomous vehicle-enabled towns. So very excited to see you here, Michael, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Dr. Lynette, brilliant. And let me just share my screen. Brilliant. So I'm going to kick things off today by thinking about Singapore's towns of the future. So often future mobility conversations center more on the vehicle and technology aspects. Instead, today, I want to shift that thinking and conversation to more how future mobility can help us with people, place, and planet goals. And later, I'm going to share some of the work that Dr. Lynette just mentioned that Arup undertook with URA on the autonomous vehicles topic too. So as a bit of context, as we all know, Singapore built environment has undergone a huge transformation over the past 40 plus years. So what really excites me about the long-term plan is all of us being involved in planning the future for Singapore for the next 40 plus years, and the kind of responsibility we have in creating a great plan. I work at Arup, and at Arup, we're very passionate about planning and designing cities. We know that cities around the world appreciate that future mobility trends like electric vehicles or shared mobility or active mobility, they're gradually changing the way people live, work, and move. And the space that we like to work in at Arup is how future mobility can support a change in the built environment and how we can plan for more connected, equitable, and vibrant places. But one challenge we have is defining what we mean by future mobility. I mean, what comes to mind when you think of future mobility under this topic? Here is a kind of small selection of the vast number of ideas that are in this space at the moment. And it's a very complex and constantly evolving ecosystem. And as I hinted earlier, very much the conversations can be a bit more technology driven. So to avoid that, Arup, we take a slightly different approach. And we try to ask ourselves a couple of key questions to enable us to have, instead of a technology-led approach, a more outcome-led approach. So the two questions we ask are, what do we want the city of the future to be like? And then how can future mobility help support this? And then we break it down a little bit further in defining what future mobility means. And we have a bit of a toolkit for this. And we break it down into 6 strategy packages to make it a little bit more manageable. So the type of things we talk about, and I'll touch on some of these today, is firstly, future place. So as Dr. Lynette mentioned, one of the themes is integrated transport and land use planning. That can often also be left out of future mobility conversations, but it's really important. And then future journeys and future data. And then thinking about what the future of streets, parking, and logistics will be as well. So this enables us to cover a lot of the key aspects. If I just pick a couple of these to sort of give you a bit of a context for, first one, future place. So some example strategies will be on screen. So, I mean, firstly, we need to think about good mixed use planning and then potentially reducing the need to travel. It also helps us prioritize and improve walking and cycling. A second one is, how can we integrate placemaking with mobility? There's lots of great examples in Singapore of this. Bencoolen Street was one of the first examples, and I think this will be a pattern where we can see more placemaking and art and other options that help bring more vibrant streets, and walking and cycling, again, will be important in the future. We then can think about adaptable space. So this is an image in the top right from one of Google's master plans for their campuses. And again, their thinking is how to best use the space over a 24-hour period and making it a little bit more flexible to different uses and different user needs throughout the day. And then also active mobility will be a key theme for today's webinar. And we have more tools now to help incentivize active travel, such as gamification or bike share. For future journeys, there's obviously a huge push towards low emissions transport, such as electric vehicles, as well as making journeys seamless by sustainable modes. So things like mobility hubs, there's a small example on the screen, bottom left there, these become even more important too. We also need to think about some of the other technology solutions that can help us. Perhaps pedestrian journeys can be made easier with dynamic wayfinding. And then there's a topic we've been exploring with URA on how do we best use autonomous vehicles as part of this discussion. And that's where I'm going to do a bit of a deep dive now. So, I mean, firstly, are AVs the solution to all our future city objectives? Well, no. Mass transit and walking and cycling are still going to be critical and the most critical. And you'll hear more about those two in the presentations that follow me. But autonomous vehicles could be one of a wider set of measures that can be planned in a holistic way. So URA asked Arup to think about this in a bit more detail. And we had this research question together, which was, what opportunities can a shift to autonomous vehicles unlock to better design our future towns? And to do that, we had a research scenario, which was try to imagine the town of the future. So a long-term plan. It has to support walk, cycle, ride, of course. It's going to be, for the purposes of our research, a brand new town, sort of a blank canvas, which gives us more space to be a bit more visionary and ambitious, to set a long-term goal. And it would be in a world where all vehicles are autonomous, but they would be largely shared and public transport focused. So that was a bit of our remit. We then worked with different Singapore agencies to think about what the opportunities from a planning perspective that autonomous vehicles might help with. There's a couple of examples on screen. So with AVs being more efficient, there's a potential to allow some street space to be reclaimed and given back to other uses, turning it from concrete and road back into something else. There's a potential for bigger parts of the city to be more shared spaces or pedestrianized. And the way that AVs can be programmed means they can help us do more dynamic streets. So perhaps the streets of the future will be more flexible and innovative. And then we can rethink parking as well. So AVs can help us optimize space for vehicle storage and perhaps change the future car parks into something else. Now, I mentioned earlier, we need an outcome-led approach. And to do this, we first thought about what we want the town of the future in Singapore to be like. So we developed this framework, which had 5 key goals: livable communities, flexible streets, efficient network, optimized operations, and healthier environment. And under each of these, we came up with 5 desired benefits. And this really helped us focus our design solutions and the AV topic onto the things we wanted to achieve first and foremost. So under healthier environment, things like protection against climate shocks, air and noise pollution reduction, pathway to zero emission transport, and city and nature, for example. Now, to show you what this looks like in design, we looked at the streets of the future first. So here is an example of a future boulevard. So this is the type of street in the future that would have a lot of movement in terms of public transport trips and walking and cycling trips. And we were able to translate those outcomes I just mentioned into design solutions. So just for a couple of examples, a reduction in lanes and road widths, because as like I mentioned, AV spacing is more efficient and we have more shared trips and public transport trips in the future, which then gives us more space to give back to people and active travel. So this means that the limited space of this street, we're actually now using a lot more efficiently. To show you a different type of street, this is one, a local or community street, maybe from your HTB to your MRT or bus stop. And for most of the day, this one is completely car-free. We call it nearly car-free because we do have to balance some different trade-offs here for different users. So we wanted to enable some vehicle access for emergency service vehicles and some restricted access for slow-speed AVs that might be for vulnerable users who still need door-to-door travel in the future. So this is, again, looking at the different benefits and trade-offs and trying to have equitable solutions too. These streets also need much less road space, so there's no on-street parking because AV storage and staging has been put into hubs elsewhere. So this enables us to give some of that space back to, in this case, green, so more nature. And with no parking, we have increased social interaction spaces, so more community gardens, playgrounds, etc. Another interesting aspect is where movement and place comes together, so community hubs or mobility hubs. So we explored different typologies of these. You can see a few on screen. In the future, these for AV-enabled towns, these are hubs, not car parks. So they're multi-purpose, they allow seamless journeys, and they're fully integrated with different multimodal services. They also have beyond transport uses like community facilities. If we just look at one of these to take an example, like I mentioned, we wanted to look at both the movement function and the place function of that hub. And again, we were able to translate some of the desired outcomes and benefits into specific design features to enhance community aspects, for example, such as child-friendly design and intergenerational facilities. At the same time, we were also able to showcase the more transport aspects that you might expect too for a future hub, such as the pickup and drop-off points for the AVs, AV storage and waiting areas, but also important active mobility features like a cycling hub. One final aspect which we wanted to dive into, I mentioned at the start about planet benefits as well, and environmental goals, and even AVs could actually help with that agenda as well. So for example, Singapore has a goal for all streets to become natureways in the future. And natureways meaning increased green in the urban fabric. These natureways would have, like you can see on screen, 4 canopy layers. And they become like biodiversity corridors, and they really help Singapore deliver its biophilic and regenerative design benefits as well. So we wanted to try and see how AVs could help with that important agenda too. And so what we did is we took an example street in Singapore. Just for the basis of our research, we picked Bukit Batok West Avenue 6, because this links to nature areas and it's already designated as a future nature way. So we wanted to think about this street in the long-term future and what it might look like and what design features it could have as a AV-enabled nature way. So on screen is an example of the possible future of the AV-enabled nature way. And it focuses a lot on street repurposing. So if AVs and shared trips help free up some space, what could be the vision to use that space? There'll be lots of different ideas for that, but this one showcases it moving it to green and active travel. So some of the features you can see in this are rain gardens, bioswales, permeable road surfaces, and community farming lots. So it's a much more holistic view of a future street. This will then help us deliver lots of different benefits, some of those environmental and planet benefits in particular. So, for example, urban heat island reduction, meaning a reduction in air temperature and land surface temperature in the transport corridor, as well as things like reduced storm water runoff and biodiversity connectivity. In fact, for biodiversity connectivity in this example corridor, I think we found that we could identify 2.5 hectares of additional extended natural habitat and also enhanced nature way opportunities. There are also other impacts as well, including on our well-being. So green in the urban fabric helps with therapeutic and well-being impacts, and an environment which is nicer and green and cooler also helps encourage walking and cycling. So those are a lot of different aspects that hopefully help frame the discussion of future mobility for the rest of the session and get you thinking about what an end vision could be. Often we talk about little incremental improvements, which are good, but don't necessarily allow us to reach the true vision of what we want. So it's sometimes helpful to start with a very long-term and ambitious idea and see how we can get there. So in conclusion, I hope I helped share the importance of future mobility first. And that future mobility needs to be part of the long-term plan and focusing on outcomes and benefits first, so that future mobility can deliver benefits for people, for the places we live, and also for the planet. If you would like to find out more about some of this work, do head down to the URA exhibition. There's a link on the URA website which provides some information on setting up tours for that. And that has some of Arup's work on this topic on display. And I believe that's running for the next couple of months or so. So yeah, with that, I will pass back to Dr. Lynette. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Michael. I really like how you begin with desired outcomes to guide the direction of future mobility. We'll come back to the topic of reallocating urban spaces later. I think this is a very interesting point that you raised, and I love the visions that you put forth, which can inspire a lot of thoughts from the audience as well. Let me introduce the next speaker. Our next speaker is Dr. Raymond Ong, who is an associate professor and the associate head of research at the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at NUS, National University of Singapore. He's passionate about translating research to implementation. His research interests include sustainable transport infrastructure materials for circular economy, multimodal transport infrastructures and operations, with emphasis on future mega transport infrastructures and operations. So let's hear from him about mass transport for car-light towns and AVs.
Thanks, Dr. Lynette. Today, I'm very happy to be here to share with you about my thoughts on mass transport for car-light towns and AVs in particular. And basically for this presentation, I'll be covering the following points. Basically, first, I'll talk about the trends in future urban mobility from a technology perspective. What can we expect it to be in the next 30, 40 years? And the challenges that could be potentially faced if we were to implement it. And some of my views on how cities can leverage on such technologies, or even to look at how to mitigate the potential impact of the emerging challenges that may come up from it, and the perspectives on integrating urban land use and mobility planning, as well as the technologies. Now, I shall first start this presentation with this picture, which I think many of us have seen it in different settings. And this is what one of our vision of a car-light city, whereby we actually have a very nice open space environment whereby we can have shared mobility, walking, cycling at the ground level, and then we have mass transport, be it basically the MRT services, and also the bus transport that will be allowing movement between towns and even in a longer range. Now, this vision basically says a very, very simple fact whereby longer distance travel in the mid-range to long range is going to be supported by mass transport, and anything that is maybe in the medium range and the shorter distance range in the city or the town scale most likely will be supported by our vision is basically to have something like walking, cycling, or even autonomous mobility that could be able to help us in this aspect. And basically, my perspective is that it's highly likely that the MRT is going to be the core for the medium to long distance urban mobility mode, and that is going to be a major important factor in our long range planning in the next 30-40 years from now. Now, nevertheless, we need to be very perceptive and sensitive towards the future urban mobility trends around the world. Even though public transport is still likely to be dominated by public rail and bus transport, we are actually seeing an increasing shift in the type of rail and bus technologies that may be adopted in the future, especially when the cost of technology becomes scalable. Now, some of such future technologies that may come in include electric buses, which we already see coming in. And of course, there are many thoughts about using buses of alternative fuel technologies, such as the hydrogen fuel or even the solar powered fuel. And of course, we are talking a lot about autonomous bus. It could be autonomous electric bus or autonomous conventional bus. But perhaps let us take a look at autonomous electric bus as the baseline. Whether it's connected or not, that's another question. And of course, later on, if the buses are talking to each other, then we'll be talking about connected autonomous buses, and how to operate such connected autonomous bus services is another challenge that we may face in the future. And of course, our railway today is highly automated. And what if these railway services, the trains themselves, are even connected in certain way? And we can also adjust the buses or rails of different sizes on demand in somehow or rather for that. Now, currently, our rail is running on track technology. So what happens if we move towards another form of technology? For example, let's say the maglev technology is somehow made scalable to the urban rail setting. And what is going to be changed in the future in terms of the infrastructure and in terms of the planning aspect of our design of a town? Now, on the private and mobility front, we may see the on-demand operations, car sharing and ride sharing, to be much more dominant. But each of technology itself may actually serve their own market, and because they simply have a niche group of travel demand that they need to serve. And we can see that the trend is basically to go electric, or even talks of using hydrogen fuel cells as a means for urban future mobility. But if you ask me, most likely connected vehicle may come first, followed by autonomous vehicle, and finally we can look into a long-term vision of connected autonomous vehicle, or we call CAV, later on. And of course, in terms of operations, it will be highly dependent on robustness in algorithms, which means that, and this has to be done real time, so which means that our telecommunication technologies also would need to be enhanced by then. Perhaps we may be looking at 5G, and in China, we are already looking at, they are already looking at 6G as something even better than that. Now, on micro-mobility modes, we can see that there are many visions, just like the previous presentation talked about perhaps mobility pods, bicycles, and complemented with walking. And there is also things that we can be looking into, like sharing in the autonomous context. And of course, now certain countries and cities and companies have been testing flying car or flying taxis, and these could even be much more scalable 40 years from today. And if that is the case, what is going to happen? Okay, and in this case, then perhaps urban mobility has to be changing from a 2D scale to a 3D scale, because now we are not going to even talk about moving on the plane view. We can even talking about moving at the elevation view in this aspect. And the elevation view is not like I am having 2 level or 3 level. It could be even a dynamic kind of situation. So as such, then the future urban mobility technology, we need to rethink about it. And not just from the technology aspect, how are we going to plan our cities in this aspect for such purposes? Now, let me take a look at an evolution from EV to AV and then to CAV. Now, to me, I feel that EV is a very low-hanging fruit that can be achievable in a short span of time, primarily because of technology and the maturity that we envision to see in the next 10 years or 20 years time. Now, AV has been thought to be one of the future urban mobility mode that is coming in, and driving at level 4 and 5 will lead to revolution in the transportation systems. Now, AV depends on a lot on the V2V technology, which we basically say as a vehicle-to-vehicle technology, and the vehicle-to-infrastructure technology. And in this aspect, telecommunication technology is very important, and it basically would require perhaps a network of sensors or a network of data sensor that is actually collecting data and transmitting data so that we can better manage the entire urban mobility system. And of course, we may be talking about whether such AVs are privately owned or publicly owned, or individually owned or fleet managed. But if we were to look more into being car light, I would suppose that having a fleet managed system would be much more efficient in the longer run. Now, in this aspect, given that we are looking at a very diverse form of future urban mobility technologies, how is urban planning, how is transport infrastructure planning going to change to adopt or to even adapt to such uncertainties? Now, first, I would have to say that we must have a vision and planning for livability. What do we envision the future town to be, a future city to be, what Singapore wants to be eventually? And from then, we need to be able to understand the complex relationship between transportation planning, infrastructure planning, operations, urban planning. And today, in a more increasing context, we are looking in terms of energy planning. So I have a rather complicated chart that looks something over here that actually says that it's not basically it tells me that it is not a silo type of problem. I'm doing urban mobility planning. I don't care about the rest. I do urban mobility planning plus urban planning. I consider these two, but it may not be enough because now there's energy constraints. There's and not only this may be a technical part which urban planners, transportation planners, and engineers we will be looking with. But nowadays, we have aspirations of our citizens, aspirations of our residents. We want our people want to know what they want to be in, the kind of city they want to be in 40 years from today. Not only for myself, but for my children and my grandchildren, I need to think about them. And of course, I need to think about the cost and economics of such operations, the users using the services, and the efficiency of the services. And of course, today, we are faced with energy. We want to make sure that there's climate change is being properly addressed. There's no environment impact that is from the operations, and of course, sustainability concern. So you can see that we have a myriad a range of issues that we have to face in the complex context of urban transportation planning. And in this case, even though we have a lot of technologies that may come up in the future, I believe that we must have a participatory approach, because we cannot be just pushing out technology without considering the fact that users themselves need to be comfortable and to be ready to use them. And this means that test bedding, trials, implementations are important, not only on the technology side, but also on the acceptance side, readiness to use the service, and readiness to support this new technology is very important. And this means that it may be even going beyond such an open street concept, which I think many have shown, that whereby a street may no longer be just a street like this, whereby you may have car moving here and then your dedicated place for people to move. We may be even talking about not having a street. This street can be converted to walking space, or even for autonomous vehicle or logistic pods to move on. And when they move on it, it becomes a road. If they don't move it up on it, then we can use it as a walking area or some other areas. So we have to be a very open concept on the flexibility of the change in land use policies. And not only that, we need a bigger vision on what this city we want is going to be. Are we looking at something that is bombastic looking, or what, or something that people feel happy and want to be in? So this vision is something that is very important, and that's why we must be going towards that goal. And finally, the participatory approach means that we need to look across all ages and demographics, not just people that perhaps are old enough to perhaps to join such forums, but also for the elderly and for the young. Because I'm designing for my kids and grandchildren, they may not even be here today. But I need to think about what I want for them. And this is something that is important. And don't forget the disadvantage, those who have difficulty assessing the system, because assessing the system and making sure that they have a place to go to, a way to go to from one point to another point, would mean that they are self-sufficient and they'll be able to get their own living in their own way, which they'll be happy about. So it's not just about us, but also about the disadvantaged who need these services too. And of course, in the longer run, we need to talk about also active aging and the considerations of elderlies and the senior citizens in any future urban mobility plans, because technology are advancing at a much faster rate than perhaps the way that I learn things. And by that time, I may not be able to learn as fast on the new technology, and I may need to ask my children and grandchildren for help on how to use the technology. And this means that the technology itself has to be forgiving in a way whereby any segment of the society, they'll be able to adapt to it and use it in a friendly manner. It's not just giving them a app and then an iPhone and expect them to press certain buttons and that's it. You have to think from their perspective. Sometimes even opening an app is a problem itself. So this is something that we have to think about it in the longer run, and this actually affects how we do urban planning in the longer run. Now, as a concluding remark, basically, I've mentioned that public transportation, mainly rail and bus, is likely to remain as a backbone for our mass transport mode. However, the technology that is adopted is likely to move fast towards electric connected autonomous technology, and more technology is going to come up at a much faster pace than we can ever learn. And this is going to be a very long journey, because urban planning needs to be well positioned in advance, because there's always a lag between infrastructure and demand. And this has to take into account of future technology changes. And last but not the least, very important thing, citizen participation, tripartite participation is critical to ensure that everyone owns what we want in this city 40 years from today, and we all have a stake in our common future. And that is why I strongly believe that urban mobility planning and infrastructure planning and urban planning and energy planning, they're actually one big problem for everyone to work together on. And I think that's the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Raymond. I think that came across very clear. I think it's really good that you're highlighting the importance of public transportation and how it will likely remain the dominant mode in future cities, and also how transport planning can be so complex given its connections with other systems like the energy system that like you mentioned, and also the need to be inclusive in our approach. So thanks so much. We'll come back to these. I think there are already some questions in the Q&A on related topics, so we'll come back to that. Thank you so much to the audience also for chiming in with all your questions. Keep them coming. We'll try to address many of them later. So let's go to our final speaker. We have Dr. Yap Fook Fa, who is currently the co-director of the Transport Research Center and an associate professor at the School of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering at NTU. He's also a member of the Land Transport Authority's Active Mobility Advisory Panel. His research interests include safety of personal mobility devices, dynamics and vibration control of vehicles, railways, and trains. He has collaborated with researchers and engineers across a range of industries, including defense, marine, railway, automotive, and aviation. So let's hear from Dr. Yap, please.
Thanks, Dr. Cheah, for the introduction. Can you all see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, hi, good afternoon, everyone. I want to talk about why active mobility is a cornerstone of sustainable urban mobility. And to add to what Michael and Raymond said earlier, why urban planners should focus on promoting walking and cycling, despite all the advances in electric vehicles, autonomous vehicles, and public transit services. And I want to look at urban redevelopment from the point of view of not so much what the latest mobility technologies can offer, but more on how we can realistically tackle the most urgent challenges facing urban mobility today. So obviously the number one challenge is climate change due to greenhouse gas emissions. And the transport sector is a major contributor to climate change. 24% of direct CO2 emission comes from transportation. And of this, almost 3/4 is from land transportation. And if you look at this, right, within this, 45% of the emissions come from passenger road vehicles. And then we have almost 30% from freight road vehicles, whereas rail makes up about 1%. But climate change is not the only problem. The WHO predicts that road traffic injuries will become the 5th leading cause of death by 2030. So every year, we have more than 1 million deaths due to vehicle accidents. Okay? And then more than half of the global road fatalities are young adults, aged 15 to 44. So it's almost like a pandemic, you know, except that this has been happening for decades. So even in Singapore, we have about almost 3,000 traffic accidents in the first half of 2021 alone. And then the third problem is related to urbanization. By 2050, it's projected that more than 2/3 of the world population will live in urban areas. Okay, as you can see from this graph here. And one consequence is that many cities are beginning to grow outward, leading to urban sprawl, where the only practical or convenient way to commute is by driving. And then we have cities like Singapore, where instead of expanding outward, we expand upward as the population density increases. So this creates what I call a dimensionality problem for transportation. See, living spaces can grow in 3 dimensions, but roads are essentially confined to 2 dimensions. So we live in a 3-dimensional city, but commute in a 2-dimensional one. So there's no way we can meet the mobility needs of an increasing population through private car ownership. And by the way, we also need to allocate the space for parking. And the number of car park lots per car in Singapore currently is about 2. So rapid urbanization creates transportation issues that affect physical and mental health and social equity. Now we have congestion, air and noise pollution, heat emission from engine and air conditioning, and sedentary lifestyle are all risk factors for many diseases that the WHO projects will be the leading causes of death by 2030. And there's no doubt that the electrification of vehicles is very important in our climate action plan to decarbonize land transportation. But it's not hard to see why it cannot solve many of the other sustainability issues that I just mentioned. And even on climate action, we can't rely on electric cars alone. Okay. So we look at this graph. This graph shows the projection of carbon dioxide emission for the transportation sector if we want to achieve the net zero emissions by 2050. Okay. So if you look at the blue part here, for passenger cars, we'll need to halve emissions from about 3 gigatons per year in 2020 to about 1.5 gigatons per year before 2040. But then at the same time, if you look at this graph, the number of vehicles on the road worldwide is projected to increase by 1 billion due to rising population and prosperity in developing countries. So it's a formidable challenge to decarbonize because we need to drastically scale up production of electric cars to switch the power grid to low carbon sources and to build the charging infrastructure, all happening within the next 20 years. And then the other problem is with the rate of market adoption. Okay, so typically technology diffusion takes the shape of an S-curve like this. Okay, so for new automotive technologies, it usually takes decades, that history has shown, to reach a full market adoption. So electric vehicles is still an emerging market. And one projection has passenger car reaching only 30% market share by 2040. And this is only EVs. And when it comes to AVs, autonomous vehicles, they are still at the starting blocks, and it's going to take even longer. So electrification is necessary, but not enough. But we need the solutions now, right? So which brings us to a question, if we were to redesign or reconfigure our city, what else can we do now to make urban mobility sustainable? We'll need a paradigm shift involving a major social change. So there's a growing consensus that we'll need to invert the transport pyramid from one that is car-centric today to one that is car-like by demoting private car ownership and promoting active mobility. And many cities are adopting a framework for doing so based on the three strategies of avoid, shift, and improve. So avoid is to avoid and reduce the need for motorized travel. And this is done through transport and land use planning. Shift is to shift to more environmentally friendly modes. Also through land use planning, but also shifting to urban public transport, railways, promoting walking and cycling, and use of shared mobility services. So this includes what we call active mobility, or what in Singapore we refer to as a walk, cycle, ride. And then we have improved, where we improve the technologies, right? Improve energy efficiency of transport modes through, let's say, fuel economy, electric mobility, and renewable energy. But how realistic is it to expect people to shift from driving to active mobility, right? So cars can go faster and further, right? And it's difficult for ordinary folks to walk or cycle commute long distances, especially in hot weather. Okay, so is it practical to switch? So I do think that the technologies that we already have now can help with shift. But we first need to understand a bit about the science of commuting. So if you look at how car trips are distributed in terms of their distance, okay, it turns out that they follow what we call a log normal distribution. So the car trip distance graph is heavily skewed to the left. So meaning that most trips are of short distance and long distance trips are much fewer. In fact, over 30% of car journeys in Europe and US cover distances of less than 5 kilometers, and 50% cover less than 8 kilometers. And in Singapore, 30% of car trips are also less than 5 kilometers. So short trips are where the emissions are because of this. And this graph shows the cumulative percentage of carbon emissions against the driving distance. And we can see that 25% of the emissions come from trips under 5 miles or 8 kilometers. Short trips are also highly inefficient for gasoline cars because they contribute disproportionately to emissions due to cold starts. So this graph here shows the average fuel consumed per unit distance. And we can see that it is a lot higher for short trips because when an engine is started from cold, emissions are significantly higher during the warm-up phase of the car. So we want to avoid using cars for short trips. And if we do have to travel, shift to walk, cycle, ride. And there is growing research into how much savings in carbon emissions can be achieved. For example, a recent study of 7 European cities shows that switching from car to public transit saves about 6.8 kg of CO2 per day per person. And switching from car to cycling or walking saves about 9.2 kg of CO2 per day per person. So these are very substantial. Then the other thing is that actually most car trips are single occupants, right? So this is the in the US, right? 76% of people driving, they drive alone. And this is basically a similar, we find a similar picture everywhere. And the average occupancy, car occupancy is ranges from 1.2 to 1.6 for Singapore. Okay, so in fact, weight is the key to decarbonization. So consider a passenger plus bags, maybe weighing about 100 kg, right? So to move this person around in a car will basically require a mini power plant that weighs more than 1,000 kg. Okay? So there is a lot of deadhead weight, okay, that does nothing except add to fuel consumption. Okay? So using smaller vehicles, right size for the trip will make a lot of difference. So this graph here, it shows the fuel consumption as a function of weight, empty weight, and for various powertrains. And we see that the fuel consumption increases exponentially, actually, with weight for gasoline cars. Electric vehicles are a lot better, but it's still a linear increase with weight. And heavy vehicles also generate more particulate pollution from tire wear. So apparently 28% of microplastics in the ocean comes from tires shedding synthetic rubber as they wear down. And in fact, many electric cars are actually a few hundred kgs heavier than their older petroleum models. So unfortunately, tire wear pollution is not regulated, and it is projected to become the dominant form of PM 2.5 pollution by 2030. So we can leverage on technology to help shift away from cars. As we decarbonize, start with the electrification of small vehicles first and use this for short trips. And for longer trips, use ride sharing, which requires bigger vehicles that will take longer to electrify. Vehicles right size for short trips are better fit for electrification because they consume less power and are faster to recharge. And then scaling up electrification of small vehicles is also easier. In fact, more than 80% of two-wheelers in China are already electrified. And in India, 80% of three-wheelers will be electric by 2026. So electrification improves the range, speed, and capacity of active mobility. An e-bike can easily go 8 kilometers in 25 minutes. Okay? No sweat. Personal mobility devices can be used for first mile and last mile transportation to connect with public transit. So many cities are also experimenting with cargo bikes and cargo tracks for freight and kids transport. And the reason that the micromobility devices are easy to scale up is because they don't need to be invented from ground zero, but rather they are able to benefit from innovations from the smartphone, EVs, and AV. Okay, and there's no groundbreaking technology in an e-bike or an e-scooter, but somehow the battery, motor, AI technology, IoT technology in combination have made these small devices ideal for short trips. Okay. So this fits right into the Avoid, Shift, Improve framework as we strive to make our urban mobility sustainable. So we want to build a compact mixed-use towns focused on cycling and walking for short trips, and it will be car light where all vehicles are electric. So here's a scenario for a car-light future for Singapore. The circles here represent compact towns where most people live and work, like the slide I just shown, and each one is 2 to 3 kilometers in radius. And in future, this will be car light and all new vehicles will be electric. And the main form of intra-town transport is walking, cycling, and micromobility. MRT stations within each town serves as a transit hub, and we can use it for inter-town transport. So personally, I do not think self-driving cars will work well for intra-town transport if the towns are designed to be compact and car-light with a lot of shared spaces where people walk and cycle. But I think that the AVs can be used for inter-town transit where autonomous buses can efficiently ply fixed routes along expressway, for example, with minimal number of stops. So this scenario with active and micromobility for intra-town transport and autonomous transit for inter-town transport, it will speed up commuting speed. So commuting speed could be comparable to private car travel, or maybe even faster because there will be less congestion. So with this change, if done right, there is a growing evidence that shows that avoid and shift strategies can account for 40 to 60% of land transportation emission reductions. So if this is business as usual, according to this projection, we're not going to meet the target for net zero by 2050. So we have to bring these emissions to within this green part of this graph here, bring it right down. And the only way to do so is by a combination of electrification and shifting our transport modes. So many countries are making their cities more walkable and cyclable. Paris is to become a 100% cyclable city by 2026. In fact, there's an index called the Copenhagen Index, which ranks the various cities worldwide according to how bicycle friendly they are. And here's the top 20. Most of these are European cities. So we have 2 cities in Asia, Tokyo and Taipei, right? No, Singapore is making good headway. We have the Singapore Land Transport Master Plan 2040 and walk, cycle, ride, aiming to be a 45-minute city and 20-minute towns, and on the way to completing 1,300 kilometers of cycling paths. So conclusions. Okay. Why urban design should promote active mobility? So we can't rely on electric cars alone. For sustainable urban mobility, many cities are adopting avoid, shift, improve. And short trips are where the emissions are. So walking and cycling could replace short car trips. Then for longer trips, commuting time using public transit can be shortened by using bikes, power-assisted bicycles, and personal mobility devices for first and last mile connection. Yes, that's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yang. I think that was very insightful. I'm a very big proponent of the avoid, shift, improve approach. So I'm really glad you brought that up. And also highlighting the urgency to move towards the cleaner modes of transport beyond electric mobility. We really have to solve this problem together. Okay, so thanks to all the speakers for the wonderful presentations. I think we're coming to the exciting part of addressing some of the questions that have been coming into the Q&A box, and also please feel free to add to the list of questions or upvote the ones that you'd like us to address during the Q&A. So I think we have about half an hour or so to do that. So let's jump in. Maybe I'll start with a question for Michael. So Michael had shared, interesting ideas of how our future neighborhoods can look like with the introduction of AVs. So this involves the reclamation of road space for active mobility and community users. So Michael, in your view, what might it take to make this happen, and how might we, cater to the needs of people who still aspire to hang on to their private cars and still very much reliant on cars? I think this is some of the questions that echo some of the questions we have in the Q&A as well.
Sure, happy to answer those. Yeah, I think overall, it's really good to see from all the presentations the importance of walking and cycling, because I think that is the key feature of mobility. And my presentation hinted that we want to try and use AVs where they address something that we want to achieve, and use them as a catalyst to do other things. So you mentioned how we can repurpose our streets. So I think that's an important long-term goal that Singapore needs to think about. How can we plan for a space which has more green, more walking, more cycling, and helps to get people out of their cars? And that's pretty complex. It's easy to do in new towns, greenfield, but converting existing streets, there'll be a lot of multi-agency needs and responsibilities to sort. So there'll be lots of parties involved: URA, MParks, LTA, PEB, and others. Like, for example, LTA maintains the curb-to-curb area at the minute. So who maintains the new areas created in the future cross-section? Will design guidelines need to change? Will the Street Works Act need to change? And there'll be other design integration challenges that we need to address. One of the big ones is utility planning for existing streets that we want to repurpose. So that needs real careful consideration. So lots of technical challenges to resolve, but I think it's an important conversation to start with so that we can envisage a long-term change for making our streets better. On the question of do we still plan for people who want private cars, I think ultimately the aim should be to create great places where you don't need to own a car, but you know, planners do need to balance different user needs. Maybe what I'd also add is, because today's conversation is thinking about the long-term plan, and with younger generations more on board with shared economy, will there still be a desire for Singaporeans in, I don't know, 30 to 40 years time to own a car? Maybe not, hopefully not. But I think we just need to begin the shift to good planning for sustainable modes. And I think that will lay the pathway.
Right, so making sure that these alternative modes remain competitive, right, with car travel. Great. Let's pose a question to Dr. Raymond Ong. So in your presentation, you showed us how complex it can be for integrated planning, to consider transport planning, city planning, as well as the energy infrastructure all together. So I think this is a helpful reminder that we really have to see the city as a complex system as a whole. So given this uncertainty in the future for long-term planning, how do you think we can think ahead for these future shifts in mobility?
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Lynette. You asked a very good question, because there is as someone who is doing infrastructure planning and mobility at the same time, there is always a time lag between infrastructure development and demand, and this is something that we have to grapple with, because that's where we need to have our little crystal ball and take a look at what are the likely things that can happen, and we have to make our infrastructures much more flexible, and I would even say tolerant to even future development. Now, one classic thing is that we can always see that in many cities, the roads have always been designed for automobiles, and you can see that, and that makes it today so unforgiving for sharing. And this is something that we have to be a little bit more flexible when we are doing planning, and to take into account potential future mobility shift in this case. So now I would say that and this would mean that of course we would have to be more robust and take in more considerations, and that is why we will need a more heavy participatory approach, because we have to understand what the society wants, what to prioritize more, and what is to give a lesser priority on. And this would mean that the whole paradigm of doing urban planning will have to shift drastically over in the next few years, or I would say in the next decade or so. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I guess a follow-up question that I might pose to Dr. Yap, which is also related, I think, to this topic of sharing spaces and being flexible with the spaces that we have. So I think you've really, Dr. Yap has really highlighted about how we can't see electric cars as the only solution to address environmental impacts and environmental problems associated with transport. So what can we do to nudge people to switch to more environmentally friendly transport modes that you've shared? And also, how can we encourage this sharing of limited road and pavement space with other users? Yeah,
I think that's a good question. It's an often asked question. How can we shift people from driving or even public transport, right? Sometimes to more walking and cycling. Because after all, the average commuter, they don't care about climate change. It's not in their immediate concern. So I think that to make people want to shift, right, it must be based on three factors. One is, the mode of commuting, walking and cycling, has to be safe. And if you use it for commuting, for cycling, it has to be reasonably fast. Not so much slower than, say, somebody is driving or taking a bus. And it also has to be affordable. so maybe I can just share one slide. Okay, because I did anticipate this. So why promote cycling? A lot of people ask when public transit services are already abandoned. Right, you got plenty of this. And if you look at the average commuting speeds in major cities, okay, Singapore is actually, the average commuting speed is actually quite low from end to end, 10.4 kilometers per hour. Okay, so that's not very fantastic. And the reason is because we have to spend quite a lot of time walking to the station, wait for the bus or the MRT to arrive, and then do the same thing at the other end when you arrive. Right? And the research has shown that generally average commuting speed is 1.5 to 2.5 times slower than using a car. Okay, so we need to make it more equitable. And if you can make it more equitable, I think more people will want to switch. And one way is to use first mile, last mile, better first mile, last mile connections. Okay, better cycling, for instance, right? The cycling network to connect to the transit hubs. And the other thing to realize is actually if we make the towns easily walkable and cyclable, right? So we only do short trips. It's actually not that hard, and in fact, a lot of times it's a lot faster. So here's an example around where I stay, and I can reach most of the places that I want to go within my neighborhood within a very short distance, within 4 or 5 kilometers. And these are the times that I recorded, okay, on Google. And you can see that for short distances, actually cycling commuting time is actually comparable to driving, and sometimes even faster. And it's actually quite a bit more faster than riding a bus or taking a bus. Okay, so if you could only make it safer through planning of the infrastructure, make it more connected and seamless, and then encouraging kids to start young to pick up the habit of walking and cycling, I think that would be good.
Yeah, I like the idea of reaching out to kids early, right? Encouraging that so that they can, walk and cycle to school rather than consider taking private cars. Okay, I see lots of exciting questions on the Q&A, so maybe let's get around to some of these. I'm going to take a question from Wenjing Ng, who very kindly put up a question about autonomous vehicles. So I think the question is put over here with a high number of votes. I think there's a common misconception that AVs can replace mass mobility systems. Understand that AVs supplement and not replace mass mobility systems, given how AVs also have their downside as they cater to fewer people per pod compared to mass mobility. Okay, so I think he's thinking about the small shuttle, small AV shuttles that may not compared to the larger public transport vehicles. So still depends on the road network, requires parking infrastructure. So if overly dependent or in lieu of a good mass transport system, would AVs eventually cause road congestion like the cars of today? What is needed to supplement AVs for it to take off? Michael, do you have an opinion on that? You might want to take this one.
I'm happy to go first. And yeah, I fully agree. I don't think we would say in full agreement that AVs don't replace mass transport. Dr. Raymond, I think, made the case for the importance of mass transit, and I agree. And I do think as well, if we just replace existing vehicles with AVs, we're not going to solve any of our issues. In fact, we'll probably make things worse. I can see other questions around actually they could increase congestion. So I think part of what we've got to do, as many of us in this room are planners or passionate about planning, is wrestle the AV agenda back from the technology companies. So a lot of the slides I showed would just try to pull a bit back so we can think about the best bits of AVs. And because AVs have lots of other trade-offs as well that I didn't mention, they could actually end up with us pushing towards more vehicle-related streets, because AVs can go anywhere. Technically an AV would be able to operate in a park. Is that something we want? Probably not. So I think there's a long list of trade-offs that we need to manage. Otherwise, like the questioner mentioned, we'll probably just have the same problems or exacerbated problems.
Thanks. Dr. Yap or Raymond, do you have anything else to add to that point?
basically that is what I have presented, that mass transport is still going to be the backbone of transportation around Singapore.
Right. Yeah. Good. Okay, let's have a follow-on question put up by Ronnie Van Munster about AVs also, but I think it's beyond AVs. I think his question is really about how social behavior aspects of commuters should be taken into consideration when it comes to planning future infrastructure needs. I mean, for AVs, and I think in the broader picture for other kinds of vehicles as well. So I think this relates to Raymond's point about inclusive and a participatory approach, right, to planning. Do you want to add on or address this one?
I think we need to be very open-minded about how we plan and design for this infrastructure, because there is a whole lot of social behavior that we have to look into. And of course, today we have seen a lot of tension between sharing, between alternate mode, for example, cycling and driving, and cycling and walking and driving. So you can see a whole lot of things that may be happening based on this, or disputes even. Now the whole thing is that we need to have a culture of being able to be tolerant, and important thing is having a fast speed may not be the right way to go if especially we are talking about streets. Streets should be more forgiving and be more tolerant to alternate modes of transport. I do know that driving, as someone who may have driven before or drive before or are driving now, you may find that there's always a need to be faster or something like that. But really it need a mind shift. And this mind shift, I would say, it will not come in like tomorrow or next year. It may need about a decade or so, or a generation to actually really change. So that's why I'm looking at this at more 40 years from today, what's going to happen. Yeah.
Indeed, yeah, the dominance of cars in cities, in many cities, even not just Singapore, right, is an issue that we are trying to grapple with to encourage this shift away. Okay, let's look at a question from Yan Jun Qi, who's looking at the environmental trade-off of EVs. So we know that in order to provide electric mobility, we have to mine rare metals to manufacture the batteries, and then there are issues with non-renewable resources when doing so, and then pollution emissions at the mines. So how has the EV industry, or maybe even other stakeholders, addressed these issues so far? Does anyone want to chime in or have an opinion on this?
Yeah, I think that maybe I can just make a comment. It is true that as we transition to EVs, right? The manufacturers have to start building a lot of electric cars, and actually it will raise the emissions initially, because a lot of the emissions come from making the batteries, and the batteries are big and heavy. So for the first maybe 10-15 years, we're going to actually see an increase in probably carbon dioxide emission because of this manufacturing of these batteries. But in the longer term, I think EVs are a lot better than ICE, internal combustion engines. So we have to take a longer term view of this.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think there's another related question on this topic of the sustainability of EVs from Karine Kalopsai, who's looking at battery disposal. I think we also have to think about the end of life, right? And what happens to these batteries, and how do we recycle them? How do we handle them? Once these electric vehicles start penetrating the fleet and then start being retired, that's also another one to have to think about the whole circularity of materials. So definitely part of the environmental picture as well. Good, lots of good questions, and of course very, very thoughtful about the implications beyond livability and all that. So let's see some more questions now. I think a lot of questions still relate to how do we get around with the shifts and all that. I think many in the audience agree that this is the way we should go, but the challenge of encouraging the shift. So we have a question from Bala Ganesha Virasamy about aging population in our city. We'll see more people are using, what is moped bike thing? I'm not sure what that one is, but it's encouraging people to walk lesser. So how do we encourage people to walk for health reasons as the mode of transportation becomes easier and more comfortable? So on one hand, we want to offer these alternative modes like AVs and connected vehicles and so on, but on the other hand, are we discouraging them from walking? Anyone want to try to address this one?
Happy
Maybe
to
I'll-
have a shot.
yeah.
I'll go for it.
Mike first, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so I think partly this relates back to good integrated and land use transport planning. So thinking about the trip lengths and making sure as well that we have suitable local areas and recreational areas for people to get some of their exercise in comfortably, coolly, and shaded. There's probably other sort of more innovative things we can think about as well. I was based in Japan for a long time, and they are really good at aging population planning, and some of the innovations they have are around particularly intergenerational activities. So finding ways to get more community aspects that promote walking. So having youths and elderly have a walk around the block scheme, or health centres. So I think there's probably a lot of things we need to look at in transport, but beyond transport as well in land use community planning.
Yeah, Raymond, you had
Yeah. Okay.
suggestion.
Just now Michael has already mentioned a lot on these for the transport perspective. Maybe I'll offer another thing, whereby for elderly, we have to look into why the elderly want to walk rather than use alternate mode of transportation, other like moped or even cycling or even taking a bus, for example. Now, we have done some survey with elderly before, including face-to-face interview, and many of them have told me and my team that providing a way for them to walk or to cycle or have a bus service right in front of their house is not really the main reason for them to choose a transport mode. Basically, they need to know why they want to move. There has to be certain activity for the elderly to actually enjoy or even go to. Then they will actually think about how to actually do for that. For example, if you want to have places for them to exercise, for them to interact with their friends, then and it's located just right next to their house, and then they will just walk over there, right? Or if let's say they are supposed to bring their grandchildren to school and off school because they need to pick them up and then bring them for maybe their schools and other activities, then it may require or warrant another mode of transportation, and it's certainly not a moped or something like that because they have young kids with them. So then the question is, how are we going to make activity and mobility more in line, and how to actually make it more convenient for elderly to move, taking into account of that, because so many times that we've been doing transportation planning, urban planning for the working adults, and we rarely look into the other sectors such as the children, the elderly, or even the mobility disadvantaged folks, that how are they going to move? And this is something that is very important. So that's why I talk about being tolerant.
Yeah, maybe we'll start bringing in the health promotion board to make sure that some of our transport planning needs consider the health implications as well. I mean, on the topic of children and that segment too, I think we have a question here from Francis Chu about safety issues relating to cycling and walking. So I think he shared a comment about from someone about how in Wellington, is it that children are able to walk to school, but in Singapore, maybe in the Singapore context, it's a pity that this walking to school is not always an option for safety reasons, because the streets in Singapore are designed for cars. So any comments or responses to this?
Yeah, maybe I made a comment. Yeah, I agree. I think you look at the most towns now and the neighborhood schools. The neighborhood is still very much car-centric. For example, my daughter just gone to a new secondary school, and it's actually 1 mile away, 1.6 kilometers. And if I ride to school, it would take about 9 minutes, and same time as I would drive. But I have so far driven to the school every day because it's just not safe. And because there are more people using the cars, it also forces me to want to use the car to drop her off, because there's no other good alternative. So and that's the problem, But so if you can make it safer to cycle, and then kids can start doing so and pick up the habit, and the schools can be more relaxed, and they can provide bicycle parking in schools, encourage kids to ride to school or walk, and it becomes a habit, And and as they grow up, right, they they will not think of car as the only option to travel. I think that's important, forming the habits while they are young. But about this elderly in this moped, actually they're called PMA, right? Personal mobility aids. We're seeing more and more of them. I think that they are actually a good thing also, because it enables a lot of folks who normally would not be able to go out now to be able to be more mobile. So they go out and they be independent. So there's also a plus side to it.
Yeah, absolutely agree that it's a means for mobility for many. And the point about enabling children to walk to school, I think it's a true privilege if cities were able to allow this to happen. I think it's a lot healthier, it's a lot more livelier to have that as well. So maybe one day we'll see that. You can put that into your visions, Michael, in your future visions of what streets might look like. Okay, let's see. We've got lots of other questions too. I'm just trying to think of which one to pick. It's great that there's so much conversations happening. I think we can keep going. We only have 10 more minutes. Let's see. So many of the questions are still related to sharing the spaces and so on. Well, another question from Francis is about AV-enabled street in response to Michael's presentation. So he's thinking about cycling streets in the Netherlands. Cars are not allowed during most of the hours, or have to yield to bicycles. Can we possibly see this cycling street before AV-enabled scenarios?
Yep, this is a great idea. I showed two future street types in my presentation: a boulevard, which is very public transport driven, and then a community street, which did have drop-off, some access, but we actually had a third street, which we didn't call cycling street. I think we called it People Street, but we had one which was even more just focused on walking and cycling. So I agree, and it would be great if those could come first, because I think, as some of the other questioners have said, we do need to improve walking and cycling infrastructure provision for more complete and seamless trips. So in the vision of the future, yes, I think we can take a lot of inspiration from the Netherlands, and yeah, a cycling street sounds like a great idea.
Yeah, and there's quite a few questions about, visioning for, many of them citing the Netherlands, about how we can make it more car friendly, cycle friendly. Let's see, just going through the questions now. Many of them have been sort of related, and that's why I'm struggling with filtering them to see which ones we have not yet addressed already. Let's see. Okay. Here's a question. It's a more visionary one from MK about design changes in housing and infrastructure in order to handle the increase in PMD bicycle population. So I think we saw some pictures from Michael, but what, in terms of housing and other infrastructure, do we, any ideas or suggestions on this?
Sorry, could you read the question again, Lynette?
Sure. This one is from MK. Let me scroll it. Where is it? Oh, I lost it. Yes. What kind of design changes in housing and infrastructure in order to handle the increase in PMD and bicycle population, assuming 50% of residents own one of these?
Yeah. So one of the things is that if you have electric devices, right, these PMDs, you need to charge them, and as we have read, right, sometimes they are fire hazard, and we used to have one fire every other week, right? So so maybe they need to charge it outside, at the void deck, just like electric cars, right? You need to provide some charging points for these devices if they become very common. Might be safer to do so. But the good thing is that it's a lot easier to scale up charging for small devices like PMDs and e-bikes than for electric cars. So if you can do it for EVs, and if you provision charging for EVs, then we can maybe also allocate some of this for charging PMDs and PAVs. After all, the voltage is not that high. 48 volts or 36 volts are still pretty standard, and it's quite doable.
Yeah, I think other than charging facilities, there's also the parking facilities, right? Like a lot of the PMA devices that was mentioned earlier, some of them have to be parked in the the corridors of the HDB flat, and because there isn't room to put it anywhere else, right? So I think we really have to think about parking requirements as well.
Yeah, I think maybe we have to reclaim some of the car park lots. If you go car light, some space could be freed up for that.
Indeed, yeah. Okay, here's one question that is slightly different, but I think it's a very important segment that I think Dr. Yap also showed in his chart of the emissions from the different sectors of land transport. So this one's a question about heavy vehicles, trucks, and construction vehicles. So what are some of the issues with adopting EVs, electric vehicles, for heavy vehicles such as trucks, container vehicles, and construction vehicles? Anyone has any thought on this? I think in our electric mobility plans, we tend to think of passenger transport more than freight movement or cargo movement.
Yeah, I think in the States, for instance, they are already using the electric trucks and for long haul, and I think it's possible to do so. It's probably more environmentally friendly to switch to electric. Some of these older, ICE trucks, and they're actually quite harmful. They emit a lot of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases. But the thing to bear in mind is that it's also quite heavy. So other than CO2 emission, as I mentioned, they also have this tire wear, PM 2.5 particulate pollution problem that we need to be aware of.
Yes, indeed. I think for the smaller trucks, the electrifying them would be easier, but it's the large trucks, the heavy trucks, that's really going to be more difficult to.
Yeah.
The battery weight itself is going to dominate.
It take a longer time.
Yeah, indeed. There are a lot of operational. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Maybe I will add another point in addition to that, because one thing that we have realized when we are having electric vehicle for the trucking and the logistic industry is that unlike the older day where they would just need to top up their diesel for operation, now they have to go for charging, and suddenly they will need to find a lot of land to do a charging, and that will be an energy used for that. And this is going to be a drastic way of operation for most logistic company or fleet operators, and this may in fact incur much more land use, and this is something that need to be and even purchase cost. They may need more vehicles to actually achieve the same level of service for the operations, be it for delivery or for another things. So this is something that we may not really discuss it very because most of the time we'll be dealing with passenger EVs, but for the companies, this has to be very carefully thought of and planned upon for urban planning in industrial estates in most likely context. Yes.
Yeah, and I totally agree about the charging infrastructure. Another point I was going to bring up for these goods vehicles is that it affects their operations as well, right? They have to schedule downtime for charging and all that. So I think everyone's a bit hesitant about this switch, which might delay some of the transitions that we're envisioning. Great. I mean, while we're on the topic of EVs, there's another one here, a question from Honda. Singapore government has ambitious target for EV charging. Is the existing infrastructure conducive for setting up charging spots? If not, what kind of upgrades might be needed? So I guess this is about the electrification path that we're pursuing now. Is it feasible? Anyone wants to take on that question? I guess we mentioned charging briefly already.
I think basically when we look at the existing infrastructure for charging, basically we need to look at a few aspects. We have done some studies on determining optimal locations for existing charge to look at how we have new charging infrastructure, or look at existing infrastructure to whether it's ready for upgrade or not. So some of the thing is we need to look at the demand. Where is it located? Because depending on whether it's at a residential town and whether it's at the office building or whether it's in an industrial estate, the pattern of us parking our car or in the car parks is very different. And because of this difference, then there will be a charging requirement that will be different, because if I'm parking overnight, then I can actually go for 8 hours parking. But if I'm, let's say, having a charge and go operation, then I may have at most 2 hours or 30 minutes or 15 minutes of charging. So this would mean that I will need a very different charging requirement. And that would mean that from a planning perspective, like I mentioned just now, we now need to take into account energy infrastructure, the type of energy, the voltage, whether you're going to have a DC, high voltage DC, or a normal AC power. And these will actually change into how we design car parks in the longer run, or then plan for car parks in the longer run. And this has to be taken into account. And for existing infrastructure, things are a bit more challenging because there are also competing energy use. And we need to look at the energy consumption that is in the vicinity. Perhaps the substation is actually who is using the power and the type of demand that they are doing. And then from there, then we can see whether is it conducive for setting up charging spots. If not, then there will be a need of upgrade. I think that's a low-hanging fruit that we can look into at this point in time. The longer one will be a far larger effort to actually upgrade energy infrastructure. So that's my thoughts on this.
Yeah, thanks so much, Raymond. I think again highlighting the complexity and how we really have to think about energy system planning alongside with this. I think along with that, we also have to think about behaviors. You know, how might people react to different charging facilities located near or far away at my home, at my workplace, you know, and how that might affect, again, the transition. But I think we're actually out of time to, you know, I think we could go on and on discussing this topic and many more in the Q&A, but we're at the top of the hour, so I think we'll have to wrap up very soon. Thank you so much to all the presenters for the excellent presentations, and also from the audience, for all the questions that came forward. Hope we find another platform to continue this.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lynette, for moderating the webinar, and the speakers, Mr. Michael, Dr. Raymond Ong, and Dr. Yap, for your interesting presentations and fruitful Q&A discussion.